It is March 15th, 1940, and the English countryside near Porton Down in Wiltshire lies under gray spring clouds. Inside a heavily secured laboratory, a bacteriologist named Paul Fildes stands before a small cage containing several guinea pigs. He observes them carefully, methodically noting their reactions. The animals appear healthy. Within 72 hours, they will be dead. Fildes is not conducting research out of academic curiosity. He is testing one of the most audacious and morally troubling weapons ever conceived by the British government. Anthrax, weaponized and refined into a form lethal enough to transform an entire nation's food supply into a vector of biological death. The plan has a deceptively innocent name, Operation Vegetarian, but what it represented was something far more sinister than its pastoral codename suggested. It was a considered, developed, scientifically rigorous plan to starve Germany through plague, to turn the pastoral heartland of Nazi-occupied Europe into a charnel house. The question that haunted Britain's war planners was not whether such a thing could be done, but whether it should be done, and whether it would work. The years leading up to 1940 had transformed the nature of warfare itself. The Spanish Civil War, the Japanese invasion of China, and the German assault on Poland had shattered the comfortable illusions of the previous 2 decades. Civilian populations were no longer safely removed from combat. They were targets. They were resources. The Blitz would soon demonstrate this horrifyingly, as German bombers rained fire on British cities night after night, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Yet, in the spring of 1940, before the bombers came, Britain's strategic thinkers were grappling with an even more fundamental question. What weapons would be necessary to survive, and what weapons would be acceptable to use? The German Wehrmacht was advancing across Europe with terrifying speed and efficiency. France would fall within weeks. Britain stood alone. The conventional calculus of warfare suggested that the island nation could not win through traditional military means. Germany possessed superior numbers, superior industrial capacity, superior resources. The only way Britain could defeat Nazi Germany, strategists argued, was through asymmetric advantage. If Britain could not match Germany's tanks and soldiers, perhaps it could find another way. Perhaps it could weaponize the invisible enemies that Germany itself feared most. By 1940, biological warfare was no longer the stuff of theoretical speculation. Japan had employed biological weapons in China. Germany was suspected of developing them. The Soviet Union was conducting research. Britain, despite its ethical traditions and its official opposition to such weapons, could not afford to fall behind. If Germany developed biological weapons and Britain did not, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Ministry of Supply established a working group to explore the possibilities. The responsibility for developing a weapon of biological warfare fell to the British military establishment, and specifically to one institution, the Biological Research Facility at Porton Down. This sprawling complex in rural Wiltshire had been established during the First World War as a place where scientists could study poison gas and other novel weapons. Now, 2 decades later, it would become ground zero for a different kind of scientific research, one that would make the horrors of the trenches seem almost quaint by comparison. The Germans, planners realized, had a critical vulnerability that was invisible to reconnaissance aircraft and impervious to conventional bombing. Germany was not self-sufficient in food production. The nation depended heavily on agricultural output from the lands it controlled, the Ukraine, Poland, Romania. But Germany itself, the heartland of Nazi power, produced vast quantities of livestock. Cattle grazed in pastures across Bavaria, Prussia, and the Rhineland. Pigs roamed German farms. Sheep dotted the hillsides. And livestock, the planners realized, could be killed. Their deaths could cascade upward through the food chain, creating mass starvation among the human population. Estimates suggested that if German livestock production could be sufficiently disrupted, the civilian population would face severe rationing within months. Widespread malnutrition would follow. Disease would spread more easily among a weakened population. Industrial productivity would decline. The entire war effort could be undermined not by soldiers or tanks, but by invisible pathogens floating on the wind. The technical challenge was substantial. Standard anthrax, naturally occurring and well understood by scientists, was relatively ineffective as a weapon. Anthrax spores, when inhaled, could certainly cause death. The disease known as wool sorter's disease had killed workers in the textile industry for centuries. But anthrax required the spores to be breathed in. It required proximity. For a biological weapon to work at scale, it needed to be delivered not to individual soldiers or workers, but to livestock across vast swathes of territory. This is where Paul Fildes and his team made their conceptual breakthrough. They realized that anthrax spores could be laced into animal feed. Cattle consuming contaminated feed would develop the disease. As these animals sickened and died, their carcasses would become centers of infection. The spores would spread through disposal sites, through manure, through the soil itself. One infected animal could infect others. The disease would propagate through Germany's pastoral landscape like an invisible plague. The practical implementation was remarkably simple in concept, genuinely terrifying in execution. British scientists developed a method to produce anthrax spores in weaponized form. The spores were produced in fermentation vats at Porton Down, then dried and processed into a stable powder. This powder was then mixed into cattle feed pellets. Each pellet contained billions of lethal spores, dormant and stable, capable of remaining viable for years. The pellets were small, roughly the size of a marble, and could be produced in enormous quantities. The initial production target was for millions of pellets, enough to blanket German agricultural regions. The concept was clear in the minds of the planners. British aircraft would fly over German territory and scatter these pellets across pastures and farmland using adapted bombing runs. The pellets would be mistaken for legitimate animal feed supplements or would simply be consumed as animals grazed. Within days, German livestock would begin to sicken. Within weeks, entire herds would be decimated. The economic and human cost would be incalculable. The scale of the undertaking was extraordinary. Porton Down's biological laboratories were expanded and reorganized to support mass production. Scientists worked in isolation, separated from the main research facility by layers of containment protocol. The work was classified at the highest level. Few people within the government knew of its existence. Fewer still understood its full scope. Those who did were profoundly uncomfortable. The Director General of the Scientific Civil Service, a man named Henry Tizard, was briefed on the project in 1941. His response was to describe it as a weapon of utter ruthlessness. Yet he did not recommend terminating it. To terminate it would be to bet Britain's survival on the assumption that Germany would not develop similar weapons. That was a bet no one was willing to make. Production proceeded cautiously at first. The initial batches of weaponized anthrax were kept in secure storage at Porton Down. By 1942, production had accelerated. Estimates suggest that between 1942 and 1944, Porton Down was capable of producing enough anthrax-contaminated feed to affect an area encompassing a significant portion of Germany's agricultural heartland. The exact production figures remain classified to this day, but contemporary documents suggest figures running into millions of pellets. These were stored in specially designed containers, carefully labeled and catalogued, kept in secure compounds surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. The very existence of these weapons became a closely held secret, so sensitive that even the military commanders who might have been expected to deploy them were kept largely in the dark about the specifics. The first concrete plans for deployment emerged in 1943. At this point, the strategic situation in Europe had begun to shift. Germany was no longer advancing. The Soviet Union had turned the tide at Stalingrad. The North African campaign was moving in the Allies' favor. Yet the question remained: Could Germany be forced to surrender without a full-scale invasion of Europe? The answer, many planners believed, was no. Germany would fight to the bitter end, and that end would only come when either the German military had been completely destroyed or the German population was so exhausted that continued resistance became impossible. Operation Vegetarian was conceived as a tool to accelerate the latter outcome. The operational concept was refined over months of planning. British Lancasters and Halifaxes would be equipped with modified bomb bays containing seed-scattering equipment. Rather than explosives, these aircraft would carry canisters of anthrax-contaminated feed pellets. Flying at night to avoid fighter interception, the bombers would cross over occupied France and into German airspace. Approaching their targets, carefully selected agricultural regions around Munich, the breadbasket regions of Bavaria, and the pastoral lands of the Rhine Valley, the aircraft would trigger the seed-scattering mechanisms. Millions of pellets would cascade down across farmland. From an aircraft flying at 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, the pellets would disperse naturally with the wind, covering areas of hundreds of square kilometers. Conservative estimates suggested that a single bombing run could contaminate enough pasture to infect 1,000 cattle. A sustained campaign over 6 months could devastate German livestock production across an area encompassing millions of hectares. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. These forgotten stories of the Second World War deserve to be remembered and understood, not buried in the archives of declassified files. The German equivalent to Operation Vegetarian, insofar as such a thing existed, was far less developed. The Germans had considered biological weapons. The Nazis, despite their pseudoscientific racial theories and their ruthlessness, were constrained by internal contradictions. They had no equivalent facility to Porton Down. German research into biological agents was fragmented and disorganized. More significantly, German strategic doctrine had never fully embraced biological warfare. The Nazi leadership, for all its moral bankruptcy, harbored lingering doubts about weapons that could not be controlled, that could not distinguish between soldier and civilian, that might blow back on German territory itself. By contrast, the British planners had no such hesitations. Geographic separation made blowback unlikely. The prevailing winds over northern Europe blew from west to east, meaning that German biological agents would not reach Britain. But British anthrax distributed over German farmland would remain localized. The calculus was one-directional. Britain could use biological weapons with relative safety. Germany could not. The Americans, by this point in the war, were developing their own biological warfare capabilities. The United States had established a substantial facility for biological weapons research at Fort Detrick in Maryland. American scientists were pursuing similar lines of research, though with less urgency than the British. When American planners were briefed on Operation Vegetarian, their response was cautious interest combined with significant doubt about efficacy. American strategists argued that the German food situation, while constrained, was not so precarious that livestock disease alone would cause surrender. The German population was disciplined, accustomed to rationing, and ideologically indoctrinated in ways that made them resilient to material hardship. More significant, perhaps, was American ethical hesitation. The Americans, despite their involvement in increasingly brutal warfare against Japan, maintained official opposition to biological weapons. To the American military establishment, Operation Vegetarian seemed like a weapon of desperation, a sign that Britain was grasping at straws. The efficacy of Operation Vegetarian has been debated by historians ever since, primarily because it was never deployed. The operation proceeded from planning into preparation, and preparation into the early stages of operational readiness. By the autumn of 1943, everything was in place. The anthrax-contaminated feed pellets were produced and stored. The modified aircraft existed. The targeting plans had been drawn up. The question before the War Cabinet was whether to authorize the operation. The answer, when it came, was no. Multiple factors influenced this decision. The strategic situation in Europe was improving. Germany was being pushed back on all fronts. Conventional bombing campaigns, despite their enormous cost in civilian lives, seemed to be having measurable effects on German industrial capacity. Invasion planning for Normandy was underway. Some planners argued that a full-scale invasion of France, combined with conventional bombing and the advancing Soviet armies, would be sufficient to end the war without resorting to biological warfare. Others raised more abstract objections. If Britain employed biological weapons, what precedent would that set? Would Germany retaliate in kind, targeting British agriculture or food supplies? The Ministry of Defense's legal advisors cautioned that biological weapons occupied a murky area of international law. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had banned certain weapons of warfare, but biological agents existed in a gray zone. If Britain employed them, Britain would be opening a door that might never be closed. The decision to shelve Operation Vegetarian came down through official channels in late 1943. The operation would be maintained in a state of readiness, but would not be deployed unless German biological weapons attacks forced Britain's hand. As the war progressed and Germany showed no signs of deploying biological weapons, the likelihood of Operation Vegetarian ever being used diminished steadily. By 1944, it had moved from operational readiness into the realm of contingency planning, a weapon held in reserve, prepared but unutilized. The stocks of anthrax-contaminated feed accumulated in storage facilities at Porton Down remained there, carefully maintained, a perpetual reminder of a path not taken. The actual impact of Operation Vegetarian on the course of the Second World War was therefore zero. It was never deployed, and its non-deployment raises profound counterfactual questions that historians continue to grapple with. Had it been deployed in 1943 or 1944, would it have functioned as intended? The anthrax was certainly lethal to livestock. This had been demonstrated repeatedly in Fildes' laboratory experiments. Cattle exposed to anthrax-contaminated feed would sicken and die. But would the psychological and strategic impact have been sufficient to alter German calculations? Would livestock deaths translate into the kind of mass starvation and social collapse that planners envisioned? The German food situation in 1943 and 1944 was certainly constrained, but it had not yet reached the crisis point of genuine, widespread famine. Historians generally conclude that whilst Operation Vegetarian would have caused real economic damage to German agriculture, it likely would not have been a war-winning weapon in itself. Yet the psychological dimension cannot be entirely discounted. The knowledge that Britain was willing to employ biological weapons, that British bombers were scattering plague across German farmland, would have had profound effects on German civilian morale. The Nazis had constructed an entire mythology around the purity and strength of German blood and German soil. An invisible plague turning that soil itself into a vector of death would have struck at the heart of that mythology. Moreover, the economic disruption would have been real and measurable. German industrial production was already stretched to its limits by 1943. Diverting resources to manage a livestock disease epidemic would have imposed genuine costs. Whether those costs would have been decisive is impossible to say. What can be said is that Operation Vegetarian represented a genuine possibility, seriously contemplated and actively prepared, that would have made the Second World War even more terrible than it was. The scientific legacy of Operation Vegetarian was profoundly complicated. The research undertaken at Porton Down advanced understanding of microbiology, fermentation, and spore production. Some of this knowledge was later applied to peacetime purposes: the development of antibiotics, the preservation of food, the understanding of infectious disease. Yet the research was also foundational to Britain's post-war biological weapons program. Porton Down continued to operate after the war. The facility expanded rather than contracted. The anthrax strains developed during wartime research were preserved, maintained, studied. Britain became one of the world's leading biological weapons powers, a status it maintained until the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 forced disarmament. The knowledge once gained could not be unknown. The capability once developed could not be entirely abandoned. This was perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Operation Vegetarian, not the plan itself, but the institutional and scientific structures it created. Today, visitors to Porton Down can tour portions of the facility. The biological weapons laboratories from the Second World War era have been converted to other purposes or simply preserved as historical artifacts. The buildings still stand, unmarked and unremarkable, their history concealed behind official anonymity. In the surrounding countryside, the Wiltshire landscape remains pastoral and undisturbed, sheep grazing peacefully in fields that, 70 years ago, were designated as testing grounds for one of the most audacious and morally troubling weapons ever conceived. The anthrax that was produced during the war has long since been destroyed, as have the bulk of the technical records, but the memory remains, filed away in declassified documents and the historical record. It serves as a reminder of the extraordinary measures that nations will consider when their survival is at stake, and the moral boundaries that can dissolve when existential fear takes hold. The Second World War was, in many respects, a conflict without limits. The Allies bombed German cities indiscriminately, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Nazis conducted the Holocaust. The Japanese committed atrocities across Asia. Within this context of total war and moral catastrophe, Operation Vegetarian occupies a peculiar place. It was never deployed, so its actual consequences were zero. Yet it was developed, planned, and prepared with all seriousness. Intelligent, cultured, ethically minded British scientists and military planners genuinely believed that spreading plague across an entire nation might be necessary and justifiable. They were not monsters or fanatics. They were reasonable people responding to extraordinary circumstances. The plan was shelved not because it was recognized as inherently evil, but because it came to seem unnecessary for winning the war. It was a contingency, not a necessity. Yet the fact that such a contingency was seriously contemplated tells us something profound about how warfare had evolved by the 1940s and how far nations would go in pursuit of victory. Operation Vegetarian remained classified until well into the 1990s. Historians only became aware of its full scope when government documents began to be declassified. Paul Fildes, the bacteriologist who had spearheaded much of the research, died in 1971, having never publicly spoken about the project. Other scientists involved in the program carried the knowledge with them to their graves. It was only after decades of official secrecy that the true extent of British biological warfare planning became understood. In retrospect, Operation Vegetarian seems almost surreal, a plan so audacious that it strains credibility, so morally dubious that it beggars belief that serious people actually contemplated it. Yet it was all too real. It stands as a monument to the desperation of total war, to the way that existential threat erodes ethical boundaries, and to the remarkable capacity of human societies to imagine and plan for horrors, even when those horrors are never ultimately inflicted. The question that lingers even now is whether the decision to shelve Operation Vegetarian was correct. Had it been deployed, would it have shortened the war, saved lives overall, and thereby justified its use? Or would it have crossed a line from which there was no return, normalizing biological warfare and unleashing consequences that rippled far beyond the Second World War itself? These are not questions with easy answers. History does not deal in certainties about roads not taken. What it does tell us is that Britain stood at a crossroads, contemplated a particular path, and ultimately chose not to walk down it. That choice, made in the face of genuine uncertainty and existential threat, deserves to be remembered not as an act of virtue, but as a moment of restraint in an age of almost unlimited violence. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Operation Vegetarian was not that it was conceived, but that it was never used. That, perhaps, is the real story worth remembering.